Okay, hello everybody. How's it going? This is Azren, the language nerd as always. This is one of our monthly meetings for those of you who are in my Discord group and are using my program on how to learn another language. This is going to be a little bit of a different recording. It's only going to be about 10 minutes because as you guys can see on your screen, there's only 4 of us here. So what I'm actually going to do instead is I have a little pre-recorded or pre-prepared, I suppose, segment we'll do now for 10 minutes, which is talking about balancing input and output when you're learning another language. And then I'll stop the recording and I'm going to spend the next, 40 minutes or whatever with the 3 that are here. And we're going to make a nice plan for the next month for them, like an individualized, personalized plan for them over the next month so they can progress as efficiently as possible towards their fluency targets. So input and output, I want to talk about these today. So input and output, if you don't know what they are, input would be reading or listening in another language. For example, reading a book or reading a blog post or reading whatever it is, reading. Then we have the listening side, for example, watching a video, listening to a podcast. Like these would all be examples of input. We then have output. Output would be speaking or writing. So for example, doing conversation practice or speaking to a language partner or with a tutor or traveling abroad and talking to locals. These are all examples of output, or even something like writing in a journal or texting someone or emailing someone. These are all different examples of output when you're learning a language. And when it comes to actually being fluent in a language, you have to have reasonably strong input skills as well as reasonably strong output skills. They're both pretty important. Now, what I want to talk about today is, first of all, is that in my experience, there are certain types of input practices you can do that are more useful and other types that are less useful. And same for output. There's certain things output-wise you can do that are more useful and certain things that are perhaps less useful. And I wanted to maybe talk about what those more and less useful things were. So let's start on the output side. I find that on the output side, the more useful types of output would be when you're actually trying to express yourself. This could be, for instance, writing in a journal and actually trying to journal about your day. You're trying to express your thoughts in a written format. Another example could be texting someone and actually trying to tell them something in text message format. That's a pretty useful form of output because you're trying to actually communicate with someone or emailing someone. Another example would be trying to speak with someone and actually trying to tell them something. This is a very useful form of output because you're practicing a skill and you're trying to implement a skill that you're trying to implement something that actually happens in real life when native speakers talk to each other. They actually try and communicate. Now, the less useful, although still has some use, I'm not saying useless, but I'm saying less useful form of output would be output where you don't actually try and communicate with someone. So I'll give you an example. You might take a group class and you have to do a role play with someone. Person A is a shopkeeper and there's a pre-prepared dialogue. Person B is a customer and there's a pre-prepared dialogue, and you're kind of reading this out to each other and role playing it. Not necessarily useless, but definitely not as powerful, as impactful as actually trying to communicate with someone. Now, you might do some role plays first because you might have to see an example first and read those out before you even have a hope and a prayer of being able to communicate with someone. Because you might be like, I don't know how that conversation should look, which is fine. But ultimately, one is much more meaningful than the other. The actually trying to communicate with someone is much more meaningful than where you're not trying to communicate with someone. Other examples of less useful output would be if you're listening to like an audio-based program and you're just repeating what the person's saying. Not quite as meaningful, still can be useful, and still, I'm not saying don't do it. All I'm saying is that you have to, in my experience, a lot of language learners tend to do a heck of a lot more less useful output and they don't do a lot of useful, but the more useful output. And what I'm saying is I want you to probably do both. Doing both is fine, but I want you to put an extra emphasis, put more emphasis than you probably are on the more useful input. I need a better name for it than more useful and less useful, but what the heck, that's the name we have now. Now, what about the input side? The input side is a bit different. I think on the input side, the more useful input would be input that is challenging, at least mildly interesting, at least mildly interesting. Has to be something that catches your attention, at least to some extent. Doesn't have to be the most captivating thing in the world, but at least mildly interesting and not bored out of your mind. And has to be actually, what's the word here? Not practical, but things that people actually say. So let's break those down. Challenging has to be something where you're listening and it's making your brain work. Your brain has to be working like, oh, what are they saying? Probably shouldn't be too hard, because if it's way too hard, it's so hard you just give up. You're like, well, I don't even know what to do. Or it's so hard that it's not even challenging anymore because it's so hard. It's like if I turn something on in Russian and I try and understand what they're saying, it's so above my level because I don't speak any Russian. It's not even hard because I'm just like, I don't know what to pay attention to. I don't even know like what the word for thank you is. Do I? I don't. Like I don't know anything. So it's not even hard anymore because it's not even challenging because it's so challenging. It's so beyond my level. It's not even hard anymore. I just kind of mentally check out or look for the subtitles or something. So probably something that's not too hard, right? Not too much above your level. Probably not something that's way below your level either, because that's too easy and then you're not challenged anymore. It has to be challenging. Has to be at least remotely interesting. So for instance, I could, it's not a language example, but like math for me, or art, here's a better one. Art for me is challenging, but I don't have much of an interest in it. So while I'm doing it, I hate every minute. That's probably not good. You don't want to be doing something in a language where it's challenging, but you hate every minute. That's not good either. So it has to be challenging, and at least you mildly enjoy it, minimally, where you don't mind doing it at an absolute minimum. And then the actual, what did I say, third one? People actually use that language. So I'll give you an extreme example, or not extreme example, a very practical example. A lot of textbooks, especially if they're older textbooks, they may not use language that is actually said by real people. They teach you something that might be challenging. You might oh, that's interesting. I learned something new, but no one actually says it. Like no one actually says that. In which case it's not very practical for you, is it? So I think it has to be a mixture of the three things that are challenging, at least mildly interesting, and then that people actually say, that you actually will have a chance of hearing at some point in time. Less useful input would be things like, well, things that don't fit into that category. So for instance, listening to music, especially if you're more on the beginner side. Less useful, not to say useless, but less useful because the way they speak in songs is not how people, the way they sing in songs is not how people talk in real life. The way they pronounce things in songs are not the way that people pronounce things in real life. Because they're singing and there's music and there's beats, you might just get caught up in the song and not actually listening to the words anymore anyway. Number of songs I've heard in English. I just heard, you know that song, I Saw the Sign from, I forget who sings it. It's like, I saw the sign, you opened up, that one. Like that song. My whole life, I thought she said, I saw the sun. Like I literally what I thought she was saying the whole time. And then about a month ago, I think I saw a lyric video somewhere. I was like, oh, is it sign? Oh, so it's in English. I thought I saw the sun. I was like, well, I saw the sun. You opened up my eyes. That makes sense. So music might not be as useful, possibly, right? There might be exceptions to it, but not as useful, possibly. Or things like watching Netflix possibly might not be the same, might not be as useful, possibly. If you're just watching casually with English subtitles or something, maybe not, because then you're just like reading subtitles is not as useful. Right, so there's things like that that are maybe not as useful. Not to say don't do it. All I'm saying is make sure you're doing some of the more useful things too, and not only the really casual, not as impactful things, right? You have to make sure you're doing both, because in my experience, people tend to do I don't know why, but people tend to do more of the less useful things and not as much of the more useful things. I'm saying do both because it'll help you. One last thing, then I'll stop the recorded portion. I find that when you look at output and input in general, people tend to do a lot more of input than they do output. Whether it's useful or not useful or impactful or not impactful, they tend to do more input, I find. Not necessarily bad, by the way, but I do think that the average person probably should be doing more output than what they are, most likely for most people. They probably should be doing more than they are. And then probably you should lean it more towards the output where you're trying to communicate with someone. Could even be with yourself. It doesn't have to be with another person. It could be journaling, could be talking to yourself. It doesn't have to be another person necessarily. So, okay, so we're gonna wrap the recorded portion up here, and then I'll speak with each of you individually, and let's work out a nice plan for the next month for your target languages. So everyone watch the recording. Thanks for watching, and let's hit stop.